Hello, and welcome to an exploration and analysis of fantasy roleplay and racist world building. I am May Zarita. This presentation has been a passion point of mine for a while now, and the subject that it is covering is one that I've been grappling with for a bit in trying to kind of understand my feelings on it ever since getting really invested into role play. The core piece of research that I'm utilizing for this is the Anti-Racism Resources Tabletop Games resource mega article. I really recommend you go check that out because there is just everything basically branches from that. I didn't discover this topic from there, but I think it's a good basis for those sources. I'm also using as a major source the just the wikis of these the fandom wikis to see how the game evolved over time and quoting it directly. Other than that, we can get started. We're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. The stolen land we are meeting on is the ancestral and traditional territory of the Potawatomi tribe, and we want to take a moment to recognize and hold space for the lives/land lost. Because this work touches on Native identity and this presentation is happening on stolen land, it feels prudent to make sure that these peoples are addressed in this work. Who am I? I have a background that focuses on advocacy, pretty much focus on anti-systematic white supremacy, working on like policy creation, community building, project management kind of stuff, and making sure the representation is done well in terms of how we discuss these topics. I am of Spanish European descent. I'm Jewish, I'm a trans woman, and I'm a dungeon master. I really started taking being a dungeon master seriously this summer when I decided to do a story. And my campaigns have kind of been derivatives off that story since then. And I model it mostly after like Dimension 20's approach to storytelling. What are we going to be getting into when we're looking at this presentation? This is not a table of contents really. This is more just a kind of an overhead look at the topics that we're going to attempt to address. First up is the diaspora of fantasy racism. Why does it exist? What does it look like? And how do we stop them from happening? How do we stop racist storytelling, specifically within fantasy roleplay? And how do we become good storytellers? Another thing is, how does D&D create a race? Understanding their perspective on doing it. When I say they, I usually mean Wizards of the Coast. I'm going to be I'm usually using Wizards of the Coast source books in this to create a precedent for this being a normalized thing since the game is so ubiquitous and built off those books. And looking at their perspective on how they choose to make races. And what are the origins of D&D races, and what are their details? What are they? I'm hoping that this presentation can be utilized by anybody who can, if they want to create characters within their world building and use it as a reference to ensure that they are not doing anything horribly racist in their campaigns. And I hope that it will be useful for that. So we're going to keep moving. 1, the diaspora of fantasy racism. I'm going to start this quote with, fantasy heroes and beauties are often coded as white. Desirable women were lily white. Elves, considered a superior race, were fair-skinned and light-eyed. This is from Helen Young. The articles which I am citing through here can again be found when you look at the presentation on its own. And yeah, this is basically the overhead. We can see this as a really good example of what it means to what topics we're going to be looking at. We have the term coded as white, so the European concept of whiteness and how that's being written into all these characters. Having this glorification of racial traits like lily white skin, and elves being superior, and their racial traits being fetishized, or other racial traits being fetishized. It's a good overhead on what this kind of racist rhetoric can look like. Who are the main contributors to this environment? Christopher Tolkien, Gary Gygax, and David Arneson. Christopher Tolkien, of course, the writer of Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, and Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson being the creators and developers of Dungeons & Dragons. And they've written the original campaign settings. They are no longer with us, but their work very much are, and they are some of the founding members of Christopher Tolkien being fantasy. Not that Christopher Tolkien invented fiction, but in terms of modern fantasy and how we interface with it, Tolkien set a lot of the standards that you're gonna see. And Gary Gygax and David Arneson also helped world build what Dungeons & Dragons is, as well as create the rules that we utilize within these stories. So an important thing to mention is that these people have contributed horribly to racism within storytelling, as we're about to see. Christopher Tolkien absolutely should be respected on the grounds of being an incredible author to redefine a genre, but he should also be looked at as somebody who was a man of his time, and by doing so made a lot of mistakes when choosing how to depict his stories and the kind of stories he'd like to tell. While we look at Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, their input onto this is actually a lot more direct than Tolkien in terms of perpetuating racial stereotypes within the D&D races themselves. As Christopher Tolkien never created a story where you get to play as a race or have that race depicted as whatever you'd like them to be. So Gary and Dave were hugely responsible for allowing people the accessibility of those stories, and allowing them to take it over. Anyways, moving on. Something I want to say is that while these are the main contributors, it is also important to understand that the people who've experienced their stories or works that are derivative of their stories are also responsible for the racism that you can see within fantasy, because you need to be looking at it from the lens of racism. If you are not, then you may be perpetuating some really gross stories. So this presentation is an opportunity to view those things, then make a decision from here on out, being able to look at it from that lens. Because while I say these are the main contributors, we know that many, many, many more storytellers are also writing very racist works. Another one that I probably should have put up here is J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling is kind of like a hidden theme within this presentation. Every time I tried writing a section on her, I wanted to throw up in my mouth, so I just didn't. Okay. This is a little video I wanted to get started that demonstrates a lot of concepts in how we try to depict these things. So this is every single word spoken by a person of color in the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Whom do you serve? Saruman. On the halfling! On the halfling! What is it? What do you smell? Man flesh. I picked up a trail. Get a fire going! I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days. They are not for eating. Get back, scum! No! Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
It was not dialogue, which was very productive. A lot of it was just extremely violent rhetoric, and they were playing characters which um, they're playing characters which are the bad guys. All the orcs in Lord of the Rings are the bad guys, and in the movies, they are all depicted by people of color, and no other people of color have lines in that story. It's really, really unfortunate. The amount of casting racism occurred while casting that story, but it's not even that surprising. It was written in that way by Tolkien, and we can see that in this expectation, the orcs being the only people of color casted for these roles sets that expectation that people of color are not represented within media in any way other than a villain within that race. And that is for 3 very long movies with many, many characters. Now, in the future, you will see that Lord of the Rings now, there is the Rings of Power has done a lot better in terms of its representation. Many people feel that it's been ham-fisted in. The only reason it feels like that is because we've never had representation within that series before. But that does not mean that representation should not exist in that space. Representation within fantasy media, even if it feels unnatural to you, is extremely valuable because these stories are based on our own lives and experiences in our histories. And to perpetuate the idea that our own lives and histories only happened with all of the good guys being white and all of the bad guys being people of color is wrong. And to say that we didn't come from racially diverse communities is inaccurate. And it is perpetuating the idea that people of color did not exist in these fantasy settings, even within our own history. So it's important that we make sure that we know the impact of our own work in works like that, where there's so much lack of representation that people can leave the theater feeling comfortable that that movie was made. But we're going to get deeper into this topic before we really start analyzing it too deep. Eurocentrism and its impact. So, this is an extremely large topic. This is where we start talking about basically 2 major influences in fantasy, which is the concepts of paganism and its influence with magic, and medieval Europe, and the feudalist system and world that is often glorified of the Middle Ages. So Eurocentrism plays a role in fantasy because many of the fantasy stories that were originally told were all based on European history. The most popular stories within Western media are the ones depicting Europeans in their fantasy world. Paganism originating from somewhere in the European continent is the old faiths, as it were, the depictions of the Fae and its connections to nature, its connections to life itself, and what it means to be alive, and what does magic look like. These were all extremely ancient forms of religion, which were lost, and they were lost, because of the dominant, Christian mindset and adaptation and appropriation of the old faiths. The lore and history of the heathen people, their supernatural elements got converted into, to different things. This, you may also know this by Fae, Wiccan, or Druidism. But yes, there's an intense amount of glorification of this era within our fantasy media. So that is something that we need to keep in mind, is that a lot of this is going to be based on the experiences of Europe. White voices, white stories. So another concept to understand about this is that defaultism is the idea that should remain the status quo if they are not defined. And the status quo in fantasy is extremely well defined. Tolkien can be arguably described as the status quo of fantasy. You have various races vying for powerful objects, having fought ancient wars, and there being fantasy monsters such as dragons. And that is a story, yes, but that is a story that has been only told, or it was told by white people, and it was a story written for white people. And because of that, you lose out on so many more things that story could be. With a lack of diversity, you can find little more than just what these extremely small group of people in the world thought was the center of the world. And because of that, they think it's fine. That's why we have this standard now of racism within our fantasy media, is that, well, this has always been like this. Why is it a problem now? And that's not it. It has always been a problem. There's been people doing presentations like this and speaking out about these issues for so long. It's just because they've been ignored for so long. And they are only just now getting around to it because it's profitable to listen to these voices at this point. Anyways, a quote reads here, pretty much all of their own evil races, and even the evil individuals, for the most part, are based on anti-Black and anti-Semitic or Orientalist stereotypes. Another Helen Young quote, and we see here Tolkien speaking with his college classmate C.S. Lewis, the creator of Narnia, and you can kind of see how deep this influence goes for this Eurocentrism, creating these stories in an isolated world and not allowing anything else, while also perpetuating racist stereotypes. And we'll get to more specifically what those stereotypes are in our next section. How D&D creates a race. When I was doing research for this and looking at those major wikis, a fun thing is a notable races list. Above that little box, you can see a complete list of all official D&D races. And when I talk about official in this, it gets a bit complex. If you go to the Wizards of the Coast, D&D Beyond page for these reference images that are seen there, some of them were kind of adopted by Wizards of the Coast, but they aren't actually official releases. So it gets complicated when trying to describe something as being an official D&D race. And we will talk about that once we get to those sections that are relevant. But the notable races, if you didn't know, are humans, elves, dwarves, and halflings. Everything else is othered because those are what's important. And it's unfortunate because even within Tolkien, they had goblins and dwarves and trolls, but those people, those races that were created, apparently were not notable enough within fantasy media to be able to be represented. And that's because they're viewed as monsters. Those characters are viewed not as an actual thinking person, but as something that is not relevant when it comes to race. That's not to say that this was the only thing on the page, but having a section on notable races and not including other races is kind of odd. Anyways, yes, unfortunately we will not be getting to all of these races that are on this list as much as I think it would be good. There was just certain points in my research that I just hit a brick wall, and there was really not that much information I could get from a certain group. If you have any perspective on a specific race that I don't cover, I'd really like it. I'd really love that feedback. Anyways, we are going to move on. So this is a kind of a really big overhead that I would love to talk about. Race in D&D is creationist. There was a god that existed within their world. They have a multi-godded world, and in that world, that god created that race. And by having a story based in creationism, you lend itself, it's not necessarily negative, but it lends itself to not think through various aspects of what it would mean to have a world that is like this, not based on an evolutionary model of how these fully intelligent bipedal people came to be and exist. And it's often not, they are not split into subgroups. These things are really thought into as wholes. But when they are split into subgroups, it's usually to feature just a different part of the world or a different culture rather than an entirely different race. Ethnicities. Ethnicities are kept extremely rare. We will see rare examples where Dungeons & Dragons does attempt to represent some ethnic diversity within certain races, but it is still not very well done, even for the humans, which we have established ethnicities for. And they kind of get confused as to whether a culture is an ethnicity, and we'll talk about that in our terms section. Monocultures. Basically, if you are going to play a race, the first thing that you're going to find out is that they come from this place, and this place has this culture. And it's not impossible to be something else, but the dialogue of the book does not allow you to, or does not lend itself to be more imaginative than what it's directly telling you and what you should expect of these plays. Absolutely be as creatively free as you'd like, but the book is not going to be your friend in that. Anyways, so monocultures are just the concept that everyone in this area is the same people, same culture, they look very, very similar, and they have the same feelings about things. And that's oftentimes how these races are depicted in these places. I also want to acknowledge that the setting that we're usually talking about is the Forgotten Realms, but Dungeons & Dragons has done plenty of times separate settings, and we're just going to consider them, we're going to talk about anything that they kind of put their hands on, but the setting changes, and that might change rules about the race, but they'll still follow those basic concepts. Something that this presentation will not be touching on that much is what it feels like to play Dungeons & Dragons as a person of color. And the reason that this presentation isn't that is because I'm not a person of color. I cannot represent that experience that well. I spent a tremendous amount of time researching this subject on how the world building happened around races within D&D, but not this. And I think it's best serviced through quotes. So in terms of the importance of ethnicities and fantasy races. If you can be purple, green, orange, this or that, something being brown shouldn't be such a shock. As long as that was just the color, but everything else was very Euro-coded. Honey and Dice is the person who created that quote during a podcast, speaking to their experiences as a person of color playing D&D. It was okay to play a black character as long as it was Euro-coded. So they're speaking to their experiences where they're meeting pushback by dungeon masters or by other players when, I think in specifically their example, they wanted to play a black elf. And we'll see that on the drow section that they're like, oh, well, you'd be a wood elf or you'd be a drow. I was like, no, I would like to be an elf, and I'm a black elf. That's the race of my character. And just how the status quo being challenged like that is not appreciated. And we will see that through a lot of citations, through a lot of Reddit posts on people being really angry about a lot of the progressive topics that this presentation is addressing. Racial categories. I stole this from my D&D and 101 on how to play D&D presentation, but if we can just do an overhead view on what we're dealing with. Obviously, putting these things into groups makes them really difficult, it's not fully appropriate, but I'm going to do so just for the sake of knowing what we're dealing with and what is the fantasy race, because, I mean, in our own real world, we do not have fantasy races. We have a socialized race of humans. That's all we've got. So this is kind of a new concept. For human folk, that's going to be things like elves, humans, tieflings, Goliaths, changelings, and Githyankis, or Githzerai. These are people who are very much like us, and there are minimal feature changes that really differentiate them. If you were to put some actor in a bunch of makeup, you could easily make them look like a human folk. And yeah, that's just one of the racial categories that exist. Little folk. These are things like dwarves, gnomes, and halflings. It's important to mention that little folk is not a representation of the medical condition, which is dwarfism. That is not something that D&D attempts to depict at all frequently. And I don't think the depiction of little folk are attempting to make any sort of commentary on that. However, that is not to say that the depiction of little folk can have a huge impact on how we might view little folk. I think the movie Elf is a great example of that. Somebody from an extremely isolated culture may view them as something else because of how they were raised, and they need to learn differently. And in that way, representation of little folk is just as important. But yes, orc folk. This is a really controversial category, I'd say, and I will talk about that each time I discuss orcs and these categories. So that's orcs, goblins, bugbears, and hobgoblins. And the terminology for orcs, bugbears, or orcs, goblins, and hobgoblins gets really mixed up because Tolkien mixed it up, honestly. Almost use them interchangeably. He does have defined meanings for them, but people, and in our own history, in world history, these terms meant different things at different points. So when we talk about D&D, we're going to be talking about mainly focused on their depiction and how it's depicted in other media. Beast folk. This is a huge category. Any mixture of animal and humanoid. Were creatures, werewolves. I think they even wear sharks, wear boars. Satyrs, owlins, dragonborns. Those are more of a kind of, they should probably be in their own category, which is lizard folk, but beast folk is just fine. Tabaxi, minotaurs, kenkus, and centaurs. As you can see, there's a tremendous amount of diversity within this group. Even centaurs are not, shaped the way that you would expect any sort of character to be shaped. They are, have four hooves and don't exactly fit in the category of humanoid, but they're still a race you can play. Constructs, Warforged, autognomes, robots. In the constructs category, the D&D and rare opportunities will depict artificial beings, and they're quite fun, and we will also discuss them. And many more. This is my miscellaneous category. Elemental genasi, fairies, and plasmoids. This is really just anything on the fringes in terms of being very unique. And we may or may not get to talk about all of them. But yeah, overhead, here's what we're working with. And hopefully we'll be able to get to talk about the ones that you like. So, in D&D, because of the amount of diversity that exists within its races, a lot of things are different about each one. One doesn't get made for no reason. They have a lot of things that are decided by race. This is called genetic determinism, and it's a tradition, according to Cecilia. And so stats, alignment, abilities, languages, and social classes, according to the book, are defined by your race. And that might sound strong, but if you genuinely go look it up, you will see, because you are this race, you know this language, which, doesn't make any sort of, it doesn't make any sort of sense. You don't naturally just know a language. You have to be raised within that language and socialize within it. And it makes no mention of that. It just it shows that you were born with it. And it also does abilities, stats, social class, and alignment. Going through all these individually would take too long, but something I just want to point out is that when abilities make sense, such as like An Aarakocra person can fly. They have wings. They are capable of flight. That makes sense. But when you have a character that is more adept at stealth because of their race, you go into territory which is really negative in terms of viewing races as being naturally stealthy. You can also, make that same look in our own history, where we at one point as a society, or not us as a society, but the Nazi Party in Germany during the Olympics were trying to prove the superiority of the white race or the Aryan race in the Olympics, and being like, we're gonna win some track meets. And what turned out to be was not true in that moment. Now, this was not to say, the runners which were successful in that time were racially superior to the other competitors is inaccurate. What that event proved was that there is no difference between people's races, especially for humans. The difference is that the difference is that Dungeons and Dragons utilizes species. These are not just different colors of human. When we start looking at stats in D&D and where it's appropriate to give character stats, I think it's most important to look at what actually makes sense, and stating that things are naturally like this, or they are always this way is always a bad way to go.
Racism is stupid. Obviously, some types of people are good at math, and some types of people are good at stealing. That's just game design.
That was a TikTok I saw on my For You page that gets to the concept of this topic, which is that race in game design, or in this case, role play, means that certain races are good at certain things. But it's obviously a stupid concept. It's a satirical mod that created for Skyrim to get to a lot of the kind of similar political issues. And you can see how just ridiculous that thinking is. And we're starting to get a little mixed up in the terminology we're using, so I'm going to put down a slide here that's going to help us through. So, race. Race is a word is being misused by Dungeons and Dragons. What word they want to be using is species. And in the current, the new version of D&D that's coming out, this is how they're switching it. After being pushed by people, hundreds and thousands of people to change it, they're changing it. Race, as a definition, is not currently done. It's really difficult to define race, and especially within our own society. But a general definition can be looked at of groups of physical traits, and that's what we're calling races. But the danger of grouping things in race, even in our own society, is bad because it allows people to feel or allows people to become separate, and you can create different policies around people of different races rather than having policies designed to equitably help people. For example, a good definition of this is, or a good concept is the apartheid in South Africa, where people are defined by their race, and policies are created to push them away. Of course, apartheid is now gone, but the historical damage has already been done, and our society has been created around the concept of separateness. Anyways, so race versus ethnicity in this case, and we've already spoken on ethnicity. Dungeons and Dragons does not have a good concept of ethnicity, especially for any of its races that aren't human. Even for humans, they do a poor job. But this can be defined as a common cultural background or descent. And so those kind of things, they'll also get confused with half races or sub races, and it gets really messy. So just look at these definitions, know that what these are. Species is wonderful. You can, the diagram I have up here is one that displays the natural evolution of the human species. On the inside line is where you can see humans, and everything else is evolved on the outside. I don't think this is a complete depiction of all animals, but I think it's a pretty good one. And that is the kind of concept that should be utilized when thinking about Dungeons and Dragons. Second terminology, culture and stereotype. When I'm reading these books, when I'm reading these descriptions for characters, it is very easy to see that they did not understand fully the difference between what an actual culture of people is and a stereotype about that culture. A culture is social behaviors, institutions, and norms found in human societies. D&D has really rich lore to describe culture and histories and these things. But it gets conflated with stereotypes frequently because the books are written from the perspective of somebody who's in the universe, usually. But it's still not done from very good. So oftentimes stereotypes that they want to, say people have these stereotypes of these groups, then get turned into, no, this is genuinely how all of these people are. And that creates a ton of damage. The definition of stereotype is a generalized belief about a particular category of people. So you can clearly see how this would be easily put into Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, next concept to talk about. I had a video that was going to play here, but it quit out at one point. So we're just stuck with this. Sexual dimorphism is the concept that a character that you're playing, specifically, this is a symptom in gaming, based on their own sex, will look wildly different. And sexual dimorphism exists within nature, that's true, but it does not exist for far as we know within humans. Humans look extremely similar to each other, but sexual dimorphism within gaming pushes that to the next level, where you have these really intense body types for all these characters for the male model, but then you go to the female and it looks like just the exact kind of body type that you scaled down and sexualized version of it, which creates a bad perception of bodies and what it means to be representative of these species and perspectives. The meme there depicting it pretty well. It's unfortunate because that is us pushing our perception of women, females' bodies, into our games. In that, if we can't sexualize them, if we can't relate as people to the female body, then we won't appreciate it more, which is gross and it's really disgusting. And of course, you can have whatever body type you'd like, but by choosing not to represent that for the female bodies, we create bad expectations. And especially within D&D, looking at that from that lens, you need to be very cognizant of it when you're depicting various characters within different races. Moving on. What makes a quality D&D species? I would say, and I'm very careful to say, what is a generalized quality species, because things could definitely have this still, but it still be problematic. It needs to pull from inspiration. And it needs to pull from cultures, identities, and topics which have been examined and looked at and are within the cultural canon. And it needs to be one that you are qualified to create a depiction of. And by doing so, if you're doing your own original work, that inspiration you're taking is going to share a story that we have within our society as common. We have the same thing but it should do this without tying itself to real world ethnicities, ideally. If you are creating its own racial identity, not culture. It also should be fair in terms of the stats. And that way because we don't live in a world where our species has just horribly different things. So we can't create a fantasy world where one race is superior to the other, because that normalizes the perspectives that race can define things about ourselves, where one race is automatically superior based on their abilities. Obviously, a species within an animal kingdom could be good for its different things, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about socialized societies, and trying to create that perception that this is a bad species, this is an inferior race, is horribly racist. So don't do that. Make the stats fair and even, including don't overpower them, or underpower them, and make them make sense. Owlins can fly. Culture. The species cannot be attached to a culture, meaning that if you're making a species, you are just doing the biological understanding of that species. You can go create a separate culture, and that culture can have its own identity within its space, but saying that here is, here are the people of the elves, here's all of the culture of the elves. What we need to stay is, here are the many cultures that elves are dominant in, that a major portion of their history is in, but stating that this is how elves are is not good. And also diverse in ethnicities, diverse in body type, diverse in so many different ways, but there is no exact depiction or perspective from this. Like we can see here, this is a fine example of a centaur, or this might be a deerfolk. Well, I think it is deerfolk. Woman who is black-coated, so they have darker skin, curled up black hair, and they have this wonderful druid garb. This is a really good depiction of what makes a quality D&D species or person. Anyways, we're gonna see more quality examples here, and I want to preface this by saying that these are not good races on their own. There's definitely obviously aspects of them that are problematic, especially in their depictions, but the cultures that they come from are legitimate. Fairies, again, represent fae and real folklore, and playing as one would not be that exotic or strange. Minotaurs are literary devices within Greek philosophy, or storytelling, and they can be incredibly powerful storytelling elements, especially for a player. Satyrs, they represent the hedonism and debauchery of the times which they were imagined in, and the cultural impact of them is profound, and we can see that within the media that we depict. Kobolds get more complicated because they also exist in that weird category of beast, but orc folk being a category, but kobolds have a well-developed history and culture within our own world. But even fairies are mostly depicted as skinny, white, and feminine. Minotaurs can be one-dimensionally violent. Satyrs are also depicted as white and skinny, and kobolds are very much attached to the ire of what it means to be a lizard folk, and being vicious, rather than giving it a fair depiction. What are some other things that we aren't covering? This isn't a complete perfect list, but there are a lot of D&D races and more sub-races, but I am not looking to depict that. If you have perspective on these things, obviously there's some things problematic about the Luxodon. There's definitely things to talk about, but I don't have, when I was doing research on this, I kept on running into brick walls in terms of how much I would be able to speak on this. But I will briefly bring them up at certain points. All right. I have left you with an awful image of a racial depiction of a Jewish person, and Yeah, the conversion between the origins of a D&D race and the stereotypes that they perpetuate is one of blind adaptation and one where some people are being told directly, hey, that's racist, and being like, nah, you're racist for thinking that. It's messed up because that's the origins of modern day goblins, if you did not know, is racial stereotypes of Jews. And we're going to see that for a lot of these, is that racial stereotypes are at their core. And examining their origins, why this happens, what are a lot of ways that this is depicted in not just, them existing, how can we be more specific, how can we stop this, so this is going to have a major bulk of it. This is the section where I imagine people will, I think I want to play a fairy character, and they're going to check this list and be like, how do I do it without being racist? This is what I hope. Fairies. Fairies are often they are infused with magic of the Feywild. Most fairies look like small elves with insect wings, but each fairy has a special physical characteristic that sets the fairy apart. This is the book description. I'll usually start these by reading the book description. And a lot of D&D's own lore is pulled from paganism. And that's great because that is directly translating and adapting something without showing it complete disrespect. And that, depiction is the reason why I brought them up in that section about, what makes a good species. So, problem with their depiction oftentimes is that they're extremely feminine in their archetypes. They're also always innately entwined with nature. They will look like usually a tiny elf person with butterfly wings. They're also usually white. Luckily, the depiction that we have here is another good one. The website D&D Beyond, when you go look them up, I'm usually putting that photo up first. What is that first photo that's being put up of them? And with this one, we get to see a black character with beetle wings, and I think it looks great. These are the kind of things that I love to see in terms of the diversity of depiction. And representation of ethnicities, despite the fact they're not explicitly stated in the book. Wonderful. Moving on. Dragonborn and lizard folk. This is a massive category that you will see its effect in a lot of places. The specific details about Dragonborns are not the most relevant for something like this, but what is very relevant is their stereotype of being the bad guy. And being a plotting evil race. With that, this originates from the sci-fi space opera. That is, a period of writing and film where there are many depictions of interacting with lizard folk in that species of people. And their desires to take over the world or whatnot. And this has influenced our politics by often, an extreme conspiracy theory is the statement of that, our world's ran by lizard people and the president is a lizard person. Here's this video that they're doing something weird. It's unfortunate because you often demonize real political movements with actual values with an intense conspiracy theory like this. But when playing a Dragonborn or lizard folk person, these are the things that you might be inspired to base it off of because you're basing it off of something you've seen. Dragons are in media are dominated by them being evil, careless creatures that are often intensely intelligent and are plotting something. When depicting like this can be quite problematic all the time. They're also sexualized, as a lot of these things are, but I think it's important to mention due to the fact of infantilizing something to make it seem less harmless and how gross that is. But yeah, we're gonna move on. Gnomes. Gnomes were something weird to put in this, but basically, because they're depicted in so many different ways, the one that we're talking about is basically the embodiment of the European or the British cottage core aesthetic of wanting to be on the countryside, enjoying nature, and not really caring much about ongoing events in the world. And with that, a constant hum of busy activity pervades the warrens and neighborhoods where gnomes form their close-knit communities. The problem of depicting something that seems on the surface totally fine is when you are choosing to represent all of the gnomes in your stories just like this, as that wacky at-home inventor or whatnot. The culture that they come from might be from that, but if you don't have a gnome, for example, as the military leader of some giant army, or a villain which is capable of maniacal deeds, then you start falling into the trope of letting the race make those decisions for you. And it can set up some damaging stereotypes. But yeah, the depiction is mostly accurate for how they've been done throughout all history. Moving forward. The Dark Elf and the Drow. Wow, this is a massive, massive topic. And trying to, dissect this we're just going to have to go through it line by line. The book description. You are at home in the shadows thanks to your innate magic. Learn to conjure forth both light and darkness. Your kin tend to have stark white hair and grayish skins of many hues. This is not a description that is all that bad. Just a basic, racial description. You have innate magic, which is a topic we will continue to discuss. And they're just giving a racial description of them. Obviously, the description of many hues acknowledges that there is not just one, skin color for this group, but that is oftentimes rare for D&D to explicitly state that. Dark elves are almost always going to be depicted as the villain, which is quite unfortunate. It's unfortunate because in their lore, they are often associated with evil. So reading here, unlike the creatures such as orcs, drow had no innate inclinations towards evil. The inference being there that orcs do, with their morality having been colored by their society. Good drow made up about 15% of the entire race. Drow are not inherently evil. Their society and religion is specifically designed to make them evil, spiteful, and hateful of other races, especially other elves. So the book does know that culture or societies are different from race. They are not inherently evil. Obviously, this was a description added, I think after some commentary about that or criticism about it. But the information attached to that comes in that section. And we will see very frequently that dark elves are just depicted as the villains. And it's unfortunate. So when you are looking to represent that, you must be cognizant of who you're placing as your villains and why, because there will be an unconscious push to go towards dark elf and drow because they have that underdark society. And a description I took here is white elf good, black elf bad. They have skin that resembles charcoal. They're associated with the evil spider queen, Loth. There's this. It has evil written all over it. A lot of the depictions are just evil people. Saying they're not innately evil is fine, but then when you only depict them as that, it gets pretty bad. We're gonna move on. But there also is a lot of details about this where if you try as a person of color to play an elf, you will get pushed into playing a dark elf. or potentially a wood elf. And that is another concept of here is like, okay, what is D&D's relationship with skin color and race and ethnicity and species? It gets complex. The elf, the regular elf. Elves are magical people of otherworldly grace, living in the world, but not entirely part of it, always in a racial feud with dwarves. With this depiction, it comes from paganism, elves, and again, that glorification of white idealism. So in this way, elves are this glorified race of innately magical. Oh, they don't need to sleep. They can't be charmed or put to sleep magically. They're also immortal in age. They're also taller, and their skin is so white, and their hair is such a pretty blonde. Like, there are blatant, Aryan racial tropes being pushed with the elf or high elf. And it's quite gross. So oftentimes I get antsy about seeing people try to depict elves in these ways. Obviously, that's how they are depicted in Lord of the Rings, hence why they are such a standard in that way. But there's just so much positivity surrounding the elves when you have the previous one, which is they were all societally evil people. They're just associated with spider queens. That's not great, just comparing them. Orcs, this is just another massive topic. So orcs are, in D&D, were not a playable race for a very long time. Technically, I'm not sure if they're even official. And the picture, or when you even do a Google for it, the first thing that comes up is not a playable race, but the monster. And that is because D&D lore established that orcs are an evil, warring race of people that are not smart, that are not capable of forming codependent societies with anything that isn't evil and tribal like them, like goblins. And it sets up this awful demonization. And the start of this, if we bring it back to talking about Tolkien, is orcs were depicted in there. He invented the orc, which is an incredible statement. But the quote directly from Tolkien is, "The orcs are definitely stated to be the corruptions of the human form, seen in elves and men. They are, or were, squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of to the Europeans, least lovely Mongol types." This is a direct quote from Tolkien. He purposely depicted orcs in Lord of the Rings as being a Mongolian stereotype, or demonization of it, which is not uncommon for white societies of that time, or of current time, to depict other people they don't like as being disgusting. And that is what we see in D&D lore, is that they want to bring glory to their tribes, and they're savage and fearless, and they always want to fight elves and dwarves and humans, and they destroy them. There's such hatred. Another one that in more recent time is black people being represented as orcs within media, because oftentimes, since black people are not represented within any of the white races, they are then depicted as, orcs are black people. If we look at Skyrim, for example, the game came out in 2011, and the orcs in Skyrim the male orcs in Skyrim are all voiced by Noah Nelson, a wonderful black voice actor who did great work in Skyrim. But it's quite unfortunate, because that just means that orcs in Skyrim were that replacement, or completely represented by people of color, by a black person. And it's unfortunate. And we see other ones like Bright, for example, that Netflix movie, I think with Will Smith, that orcs are all black people too. And you can just see that imprinted everywhere on media. And it's unfortunate because it comes up with awful racial stereotypes. Moving on. So an important detail, I just talked about the elf and the elf and the orc. Well, there's this thing in D&D called half races, and there's half orcs and half elves. In previous D&D things, half orcs were the only way you could play anything close to an orc. They had literally written, that you could not play as an orc because they were not smart enough to be able to exist appropriately within a group. And it's awful because orcs are being treated like just like something bad. But when you start thinking about, what if they bred with a human, what comes out is a fecund and orcs are fecund and create many crossbreeds, most of them of the offspring of such being typically orcish. 1/10 of orc-human mongrels pass for human. That is a direct description from the book, and it's disgusting. Because it talks about the concept of passing as a human. If you're not familiar with the concept of passing, people can often say, I pass as a white person. And despite the fact, I hold this heritage, and it lends me privilege in spaces and not privilege in others. In this way, we see the same thing. They're passing for human. That's the goal, just because their human parentage was the one that they invested time into. And fecund in this case means that they can't breed. They can't have any more kids. They are sterile. And that is true when you start thinking about for species, such as when you breed a horse with a donkey and you get a mule, the mule can't have any kids. It's going to be infertile. But we do not see that for half-elves. And it's just blatant racism because we're viewing orcs as being somehow too far from the humanoid race to be able to even consider being able to get along with us. It has to be the half-orc. Eventually, people pushed hard enough, and we now have an orc playable race. But there's still so much detail about you're really stupid, and it's any surprise that you get around in society and people hate you. Anyways, what is really bad about half races is the concept of being half anything. You are not half of a black person if you had a black parent and a white parent. And because that we have that perception in our society, people will often be described as such. That is dehumanizing. Because you are a whole person. You shouldn't be half anything. And because of that, we get things like this, where people are half orcs, half elves. Another one here is, this is a direct quote from another article. Lately, rereading Dragonlance has been painful for him, and not just because the depiction of biraciality. He points out to the gully dwarves, written as unintelligent subhumanoids. They're portrayed as being profoundly mentally disabled to the point of not even having a language. This concept is gross. The idea that there is a biraciality group out there who is either some subspecies, subhumanoid, unintelligent, is just racism. If any intelligent other species were out there, their cultures would just be as valid and just as valuable. A lot of this language comes from that European-centric eugenic movement of thinking races are lesser. Yeah, and again, this gets conflated with subspecies and marks and different things like that. But no, this is awful. This should not happen. you should absolutely be depicting half elves and half orcs, as well as half other things, depending on your preference as a DM as what you think is scientifically possible. But really, it's fantasy. What does it matter? So yeah, we're going to be moving on. Humans. A lot of times for humans, the conversation of them being a boring race inevitably will come up, and there's probably a lot of reasons for this, but a major one is that we are human. If we're projecting our image into this, and humans can be so diverse, then trying to depict them as one way can be challenging. So in this example, humans, the base human, you get to pick 2 abilities. You can speak, read, and write Common, and 1 extra language of your choice. There's also, for book descriptions of them physically, there are 8 descriptions. There are different ethnicities being depicted, different races being depicted. And yeah, the one thing that can be said about humans confidently in Dungeons & Dragons, the setting, is that they're adapted and talented. But this concept comes from the idea of the reason that we are racially, or as a species, why we were successful when we gained intelligence or gained consciousness. And that's because our adaptability, using tools in our space, creating so much stuff. When that superiority concept that we're better from any other species that couldn't do that gets weird when you start considering that every other culture had that in this world, in this setting. But whatever. Humans are adaptable and talented in this world. What I really want to start focusing on is the human ethnicities. This is a Turami. They are native to the southern shore of the inner sea. The Turami people are generally tall, muscular, with dark mahogany skin, curly black hair, and dark eyes. This is our depiction of black people within our media, and within Dungeons and Dragons. And it gets difficult to understand, who our parallels are within this space if you're trying to project real cultures, and it gets extremely vague. But I'm going to be looking at it on the binary of, are you depicting a Caucasian person, or are you depicting something else? So in this one, if we're just go through the list here, the Kalashite are Arabic, I think, in inspiration. Their description is shorter, slighter in build than most other humans. You can see by their garb that depiction is true. Then we have the Chundathan. They are Caucasian, slender, tawny-skinned folk. And the fun thing on the wiki, the Chundathan head there, the category head, is in big letters and in bold. So I'm not sure if that's some bias-y playing within the make there. But then we have the Demarian. They're, again, just Caucasian. They're a moderate height in build. Wow. Then we have Aluskins, which, again, are just another flavor of white person. Then we have Mulan, which are North African, I think, in inspiration. Tall, slim, amber-skinned, or sallow skin tone. Then we have the Rashemi, which might be Persian. Rashemis tend to be short, stout, and muscular. And the Shao, East Asians, they're yellowish bronze in hue. And then finally we have the Tetherian, which are probably Roman in inspiration. But if you've been keeping count, that's 4 white races being depicted here. And that is so unnecessary, or maybe it is necessary that you depict that many cultures. But it shows how much there is such a European bias and how many things that just are not represented in this list. And it's unfortunate because if you would have seen some amount of effort put into any of the other races, we could have had some really great impact. But no, this is what we see. There's also something called variant humans. The variant humans talk give credence to the idea that I am picking a race because of its statistical advantages. Because you have the normal human, you know what those stats were. I don't like those. I want this one. And there's whatever stat trade-off it is. I don't really, it's not really that relevant. But another important detail is that this creates no difference in the character. They're in lore, there is no such thing as a variant human, and it's questionable if there's any a variant of any other race. Another thing is that what's other featured is marks. Marks are what allow humans to utilize that magic ability or dark vision, because people playing humans felt left out. They refused to play any other race, and they wanted to feel included in that space, which is fine. The concept of people being innately magical, being exclusive to that race, is a bit odd, but we can see that races in D&D are not really about the culture that they come from, or at least not for the creators at least. They're about stats, which is, again, a really weird place to make this come from. But we're gonna keep moving on. So we're gonna move on talking about the Githyanki and the Githzerai. At one point, there was one species called, I think, the Gith, and they were enslaved by mind flayers. And over thousands of years, they were imbued with psychic abilities, this race. Then they overthrew their captors, and they left. But they left in a feud state. Meaning that they disliked each other, and two races split off, I guess over thousands of years potentially. Basically, these different tribes had different perspectives on life potentially, and now they hate each other. And this is a great example of Dungeons & Dragons not really understanding the difference between a culture or a race, and it's struggling with that when it's storytelling. This is a okay story. What should be more present within it is the idea that these are not very different people. This is a cultural battle. Those cultures might have access to different abilities, but that's not to say they are totally different races. And so it's another good example of their questionable writing. Hobgoblins exist in that awkward category of orc folk. I think the origin section put this best, saying English Puritans later started using the word hobgoblin, originally meaning a friendlier version of a goblin, to mean demon. Tolkien used the word hobgoblin to mean a bigger goblin. And this is where we see that, since it's so deep in European, folk tale history and lore, you get mixed definitions on what they should be. But we see a nice balance of that concept within the depiction of Hobgoblin as they are. They are a quote-unquote more civilized goblin that is more looks like a humanoid. And its representation within that space is what it is. But they have a complicated relationship to all the other races in terms of what they are. But yes, they exist. The dwarf, one of my favorite races in D&D, or one of my favorite species. My username is dwarfs. And I named myself that after watching all the Hobbit movies in a row. Which I know is very ironic if I talk about the problematic nature of them. But nevertheless, I just was obsessed with dwarves, and I think their depiction is so exciting. So where we get the origin of dwarves is Jewish stereotypes from Lord of the Rings. Tolkien wrote the dwarves as Jewish stereotypes. He fully admitted that. And through their love of gold, craftsmen, as well as being secretive, those were the major stereotypes of the time. If you didn't know, he wrote that at the kind of early stages of World War II in terms of the rising tensions. Then World War II happened, and the Nazis started writing to him, being like, "Hey, we love your book about the racial depictions of Jews. We would like more of this." And then he realized where he went wrong. Tolkien was a progressive man for his time, and if given the opportunity to do better, he absolutely would. So the Nazi treatment of the Jews before and during the Second World War made Tolkien realize that such stereotyping could have horrifying consequences, causing him to drastically alter the image of the dwarves in the works he wrote after The Hobbit, notably The Lord of the Rings. But according to Brockman, this change merely served to turn a negative into a positive stereotyping without solving the underlying problem that thinking in stereotypes is wrong to begin with. That is what's important. It's that, yes, this is a racial stereotype, but let's not think inside racial stereotypes. How can we service the culture better than that? Nowadays, they're thought of as greedy, obsessed with gold, crafty, brash, uncouth, and drinkers. That's a lot of times because of their mixture with Scottish actors or Irish people. And it gets complicated. The original origins, though, are in the Dvergar in Norse legend, these craftsmen that would make things for the Norse gods. It's really cool, and pulling from there is a perfectly appropriate place to go. Anyways, we're going to be moving on. We're still going to be talking on the concept of Judaism and its depiction. A friend of mine sent me this definition from a dictionary where it depicts a phylactery. To read this definition here, it says either of two small leather cases holding slips inscribed with scripture passages. One is fastened with leather thongs to the forehead and one to the left arm by Orthodox or conservative Jewish men during morning prayer on weekdays. And this is a historical, culturally significant article of ceremonial tradition. But once we get into Dungeons and Dragons, we see that more as a literal demonization of it. A lich is immortal because it binds itself to its phylactery, which is just kind of a valuable object shaped like in an edgy way. So a normal practice for an entire people gets turned into a tool for evil, and that perpetuates its literal demonization of these religions by taking this. And moving on to our apex category here, the thing that we've all been waiting for. Goblins are racist depictions of Jews. So, when looking at this topic, it is very easy to spout off hundreds and hundreds of examples. The one that's most in right now, current time, most popular is J.K. Rowling's depiction of goblins within her world building, and the film as well as the game that has recently come out about goblin kind. And there are, this stereotype has, again, its origins within Nazi propaganda and, demonizing Jewish people into these characters. The movie Jojo Rabbit goes, I'm not even sure if it's satirical, it's probably legitimate level to how much they were hyped up as monster people. And goblins, again, are just depictions of that. For example, the tweet I have here depicts the two images side by side, one of them being a little badge that you earn in Hogwarts Legacy for killing a certain amount of goblins, while the one to the right is a Nazi propaganda poster telling you how evil the Jews are. And they are extremely similar because they are linked within that level of propaganda. And it's awful. But there's a ton of pushback from the fantasy or roleplay community when talking about this subject, because people find that talking about these subjects in these ways is oftentimes too woke, or it's not relevant. You know, goblins aren't Jewish people. If they were Jewish people, it would say that they were Jewish, rather than all of these stereotypes, and that you're the bad person for pointing that out. That brings up an interesting video on my next slide, which we will watch together.
Is Jewish stars at Gringotts. The Star of David can be found on the floor pattern of Gringotts Bank, and many people have pointed to this, as well as the depiction of the goblins who hoard gold, have long noses, control the world's banks, are disloyal, as well as various other things, to all be a big anti-Semitic metaphor or joke, I guess. This idea that the goblins are supposed to be an anti-Semitic depiction of Jewish people has only grown more and more with all the controversy that already surrounds J.K. Rowling. But I'll be honest, this one seems very unintentional. In fact, this whole thing kind of reminds me of the controversy and stupid debate people have over getting upset at orcs being evil in fantasy fiction because they say they represent African Americans. What exactly made you think of people of color when you saw the big mean green monster race who relishes in warfare and sometimes works for the world's literal Satan/Dark Lord, are often tribal, mindless brutes and relish in torturing and eating other races at times? I know Jewish people aren't the first thing that I think of when I look at these goblins. And maybe if you see races of people and weird monster people in fiction, that says more about you than the actual intent of the book.
That is such a frustrating thing to sit through. I love iceberg videos, but I'm now finding that iceberg videos are not giving me any more good information on any subjects. There we saw a white male nerd talk about his opinions on racial depictions within media, and how, to summarize their point, that by pointing out the clear racial stereotypes within any depiction, you are the one making those connections, since they are not. Being ignorant of an issue is not a sign of superiority on it. Because you never made that connection is not meaning that you are not a racist person. It means that you are not aware of racism. I don't know why I pronounced it like that, but nonetheless, we see some awful arguments being made here. I've also depicted some citations or some Reddit posts. Reddit is an awful place. Do not go to Reddit, or do what you want. It's a great place for community building. But like, there's just some really funny examples of people having these weird perspectives on how racism functions. But a underlying overhead, well, that's literally the same thing, is the lesson is to recognize this. You must be able to understand the concept of racism within media. And when you are having a conversation with someone being like, hey, I found this racist and I did not like it, and saying, well, that's pretty racist of you to say that, is so bad. And we perpetuate these stories by defending bad authors in this way. One of the other things I found on this Reddit post was somebody saying, who cares? It's your game. Change it. They're right, but not about who cares. You should care. You are responsible for caring. If you're, like this person is, a dungeon master, you should not be perpetuating racist storytelling like people have been for a very long time. And once we get into your own freedom as a storyteller, we can see things like racial disparities within media, which gets normalized. And people, a majority of people are not informed enough to make non-racist stories. And we're getting to issues of ignoring it when you're presented with it. And within another person's work, you know, obviously you have control over your own world and you should be making them with these things in mind. But, you know, just supporting somebody's work blindly, despite the fact that they perpetuate this, is really bad. You need to integrate diversity into your storytelling by seeking out cultural experiences. That's honestly the best way to start having really diverse perspective within your media or the media you create, is by getting yourself more experiences. And that does not look like you fetishizing them by going to a giant convention dedicated to their culture within, you know, a 40-minute drive of your house. It means actually integrating yourself within a community, being supportive of it, learning, being mostly silent while listening to people, and rather than arguing about how life is ran. That's what it's about, and we don't see a lot of that. So if you really want to start caring about this, that's how you can start contributing to it, by expanding your horizons. One last fun interaction. The TLDR of this posts, or the chat room that it was that a DM decided to add a Leonin race that is like a lion person, and customized to the player's description. And they're talking about how to do so. And another user found this distressing because there are so many options. Why couldn't the player just pick one of the other options? This shows a level of comfort regular D&D players have with the status quo. This person would likely not allow someone to play a race that they themselves felt comfortable with and push them to make a choice they didn't want. And you can see that conversation played out here. And the post that I have in the corner there from Steel Dragons is a post stating, what is the image to define a class? And they have people collect, this is what my thoughts are on what a barbarian looks like. And they're inevitably all white and various cultural stereotypes. And so this is a person that lives for that expectation of like, this is the one way something is, and I'm going to live for that. The Firebolgs. I really don't have much experience with this D&D race in terms of where I've seen it depicted. But where I have seen it is this awful D&D campaign that is around 20 hours long called, I think it's Graduation Year. It's made by, one of those people who are just like an online personality in the D&D community. And there's a great video essay that goes into how problematic the campaign setting they had created was. And it was this pseudo take on Harry Potter and Strixhaven, but also like heroes in capitalism. It was a huge mess, and they have a Firebolt character played by one of the players in there, and they have a very bad origin story, which is they existed within their native Firebolt tribe and community, and as soon as they pitched the idea of like, guys, what if we stored berries in the winter, that way we could have them in the spring, he was shunned and potentially banished from his tribe because that was like too smart, or that didn't make sense to that people. And the way that he talks about it was within the mindset of capitalism and using market capitalism, and him being shunned for it. The problem is that Firebolg's lore is pretty fine, and they even have a section in their lore that talks about they store food for different seasons. So this person just lied to perpetuate their idea of a race or a culture, which is native cultures. And this is where it starts getting really problematic if you as a player start perpetuating this. Because despite the fact that this character comes from a different culture that you are not used to, they are still you. Even if you're playing a character which is evil, and you would never do their actions, they are perpetuating your philosophies around life. And you are using the story you're creating to justify that action. You're using the world building that the DM is helping you create to do so. And it creates awful depictions of these people. So be very careful. This is our native section of the presentation. So be very mindful of when you pull characters and races from those environments. Why are they the way that they are, and what is their experience with their culture, and how does that interfere or complement once they start entering cultures that they have maybe not been exposed to.
Content warning.
Oh.
The following video contains
There we
discussion
go.
of topics
We have
such as
the-
racism.
I'm not looking to
These
play
things.
it.
The brothers have a heart.
There we go. I recommend you watch it. It's really good. Okay, next one. Yuan-Ti. Yuan-Ti are like the Drow in the way that they are. There's so much to unpack about what makes them truly problematic as a depiction of any race. And remember, you as a DM can do whatever you'd like. I've just added a Yuan-Ti character into one of my campaigns, but I did it with the cognizance of how their depictions are usually done, and trying to challenge that. So, in this, the Yuan-Ti were devout demon worshippers. Their worship often involved bloody sacrifices. The Yuan-Ti were once human, fell to infiltrating humans and demi-human societies through their organizations and long-sighted plots. This is where we see the continuation of that lizard folk propaganda conspiracy infiltrating the legitimate lore of the Yuan-Ti. The Elder Scrolls, for example, has a lizard folk race, and it's extremely diverse, just like we're going to see with the Yuan-Ti. They have sub-races and minor races. Don't have to get into the details of why that's weird. But yes, their stereotype is they're corrupt, degenerate monsters, and they're innately evil. And they have a lot of magical abilities. And we're seeing, again, a lot of those origins from native cultures of them being mystical, but also conniving and sacrificial. It's just very aggressive. And we're going to talk about the other races. So we have the purebloods, which are just mostly human with the slit eyes of a snake. And half-bloods, which are kind of more within that were creature boundary, where just their head is the head of a snake. You can see depictions like this in Dark Souls. They have them. Abominations, which if you name a race that's already a bad starting point. And the abominations are they're just snake people or snakes that have arms and are intelligent, according to some source books. Then they get into something called the minor sub-races. I think these are things that are usually considered like monsters rather than anything that you could potentially play. So we have the Anathemans. They were truly bizarre in appearance. It looks like they just have 3 heads rather than the one head in the Abomination. The Holy Guardians, just a specific breed, and they are temple guards usually, and Mage Slayers. They have magical abilities innate. And then the Ignans, which feels like a weird word to say, but they're a volatile subspecies created by infusing Yuan-Ti with elemental energies. This is weird, and these depictions are not created with any respect to the the cultural origins that they potentially have. And even in their own existence as a race, they are racist. Despite the fact that you are creating the canon you are creating, that canon is built on a weird mindset that a specific breed is temple guards. What? All right. But yes, very weird. Moving on, tabaxis. Now, I was really pleasantly surprised by the tabaxi. Now, I think during my practice, I kind of talked to the idea that we have potentially a lot of respect for cats within human culture, since they were, as an animal, one of the most revered and worshipped creatures, not for any specific livestock reason, but as a companion species. And I think that might be why there might be such kind of an okay depiction of them. But we'll get into the details of that. Their book descriptions state, hailing from a strange and distant land. Wandering tabaxi are cat-like humanoids driven by curiosity to collect interesting artifacts, gather tales and stories, and lay eyes on all the world's wonders. Ultimate travelers, the inquisitive tabaxi rarely stay in one place for long. Their innate nature pushes them to leave no secrets uncovered, no treasures or legends lost. In Dungeons & Dragons, the tabaxi race is named after the fictional species of feline humanoids found in the fantasy world of Matstika, which is part of the Forgotten Realms campaign setting. The Matstika setting was first introduced in a series of novels and incorporated into the D&D game. The name tabaxi is likely derived from the Nahuatl word Tapachultecal, which means jaguar lord. Nahuatl language was spoken by the Aztecs and was used as a basis for language spoken by the Mexicans in the Forgotten Realms settings. So this is, again, a very clear, inspired by, native cultures of South America, or specifically the Aztec cultures. Moving on, again, their stereotypes is that they're sneaky, untrustworthy, and they often another racial stereotype that they are connected with is Romani people. And their depictions, and we'll get to that later. But capping off the section on anti-nativist depictions, there is, just a lot of very clear insight from this. The appropriation of these cultures and its fetishization of making them appear aesthetic and exotic is gross. Frequently, a race of leopard or snake people are replacements for the actual cultures of ancient South America. This type of representation can be problematic because it erases the rich history, diversity, and complexity of these cultures and perpetuates harmful stereotypes and biases. So, why do we create racial parallels? In the eyes of some people, we don't create racial parallels. If they aren't that, then they aren't. But we do. And why does it happen? And is there a way to do it good? When is it okay to make a racial parallel? So in this overhead segment, I want to explain that you really need to be careful when you're trying to make any sort of depiction. Trying to engage with the culture directly, having a large amount of experience base in talking with people from that culture is often the best path to getting something that is truly representative. Relevancy. The story must have time to service its themes larger than just the original concept. So you can't just put in a person for representation's sake and be done with it. That's tokenizing. Their stories need to be central and need to be well thought out and explained. Statement. Awareness is good, but calls to actions are better. This is where I get into the concept of, if you are going to depict something like this in your stories, then you need to be prepared to send a message about it. Because just saying, racism happened at one point, guys, and then not encouraging or rewarding your players for combating it or creating change within the environment is bad. Because you just say, oh, well, racism happened, let's move on. Is just not a good way to explain a story. Accuracy. Without accuracy, you risk misrepresenting and doing more harm than good, because you could create some depiction that is a gross representation of stereotypes. So again, making sure you're being as historically accurate as possible. I am planning a D&D campaign right now that is based on the works of the Bible and the way that the Bible depicts different historical cultures over the many years. And I'm doing a lot of research with a historian friend of mine on what that looks like. Because I did not grow up in that culture. I don't know what that is. So make sure you're doing research. Omneity. This means that you need to be prepared to depict all the complexities of the issue. The binary of good and evil is really dangerous because we don't really learn anything from it. For example, we have so many stories that depict an absolute evil, and oftentimes people feel justified by doing this by saying, the Nazis were an absolute evil. Nazis were not an absolute evil. The people of Germany were horribly harmed by a politically dominant party. And just stating that all the Germans in Germany were bad is just not accurate. And it can be really, honestly, boring to have a story just depict, hey, here's the bad guys, they're fascist and aesthetic, and we're the good guys. Really does not get to tell us anything about how our world functions in reality. I have, for example, a really strong example of this is if you've seen the movie Jungle Cruise. The movie Jungle Cruise stars Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and I was really worried about the movie because I thought it was just going to be about. I thought it was just going to be about like Jumanji. I thought it was going to be like Jumanji, the reboots, and luckily it wasn't. It was actually an incredibly good commentary on colonialism. And the way it did that, spoilers for the movie, is by depicting the main character, or not the main character, but the other main character, the male lead, Dwayne's character, as this guy who runs a river cruise in the Amazon rainforest and plays tricks on people, but then is taught lessons throughout his adventure or that make him come to terms with his past. And really deep into the movie, they reveal that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, his character, was actually a Spanish conquistador, which got cursed by native magic and cursed to be immortal within the Amazon. And he lives with that and grew up through the centuries. And when our story takes place is in World War I, or time similar to that. And we see a vaguely Nazi depiction, colonial depiction of these highly what is it called? The concept that Nazis are always chasing after the magic of the world, like in Indiana Jones. So then he juxtaposes them by displaying, I was a colonial person at once. I was coming here to dominate these people, and it did not end well. I wasn't forced to come here. I just had to live with that. And now he has to face it again by preventing this German force from getting to the magical immortality MacGuffin. And he redeems himself through that and explores that topic and deals with his own concept of greed and selfishness by being selfless. It's a wonderful story, and that's why it's so good to display the omneity of the subject, even if that looks like depicting what the bad guys are in the world. The bad guys are not just racism. What is the actual problem? So we're going to be moving on. I referenced briefly that the catfolk depictions can often be conflated with Romani depictions. And defining Romani gets really difficult. But generally, they are a culture mainly found in Europe and Eastern Europe, and they're a very much marginalized people, more so than many people even are aware of. And their history goes very deep within the history of Europe. Anyways, the Omani people are often compared, especially if you look at works like Skyrim, to that. It's important to clarify that Khajiit in Skyrim are not specifically intended to represent Romani people, but rather a race of cat-like humanoid creatures within the game's fictional universe. However, if we consider the criticisms of the portrayal of Romani people in game and apply them to the Khajiit, some potential inaccuracies and problematic elements could include homogenization. Man, words are difficult at this moment. Khajiit are portrayed as a homogeneous group, despite the fact that within the game's lore, they have different sub-races and cultures. Again, Elder Scrolls, they popping off with diversity sometimes, but only in their lore. Stereotyping. The Khajiit are often associated with thievery and other criminal activities, which can be seen as perpetuating negative stereotypes about Romani people as being inherently evil or untrustworthy. Othering. The Khajiit are often portrayed as being other or different from the rest of the people in the game. For example, you cannot find Khajiit outside of the caravans and Maik the Liar and one person at the College of Winterhold. Which can contribute to the negative attitudes towards Romani people and perpetuate the harmful stereotypes of them as outsiders and not like us. It's important to note that the portrayal of Khajiit in Skyrim, as with any fictional race or culture, is subject to interpretation and can be perceived differently by different people. The key is to approach all media with the critical eye and consider how it may perpetuate harmful stereotypes and contribute to a more positive, inclusive society. So let's look at this depiction. Its relevance: a population of stateless people have easy footholds within a story about warring kingdoms. It makes a statement. There's frequently a lot of in-universe prejudice. This gives viewers an opportunity to realize that they need to take a stand against it. Accuracy. They're often nomadic, spiritually connected, resourceful, talented, diverse, and hardy. And omneity. The lore of catfolk cultures, their pre- and post-colonial histories, and their feelings are frequently fully developed. So that's just one racial depiction. Another one is Warforged. And you're saying, what? Warforged? Those are robot people. How could they be anything to do with race? And allow me to read some of the descriptions from the Eberron book about this people. So they are fully sentient soldiers, blending organic and inorganic materials. Warforged are made from wood and metal, but they can feel pain and emotion. Built as weapons, a steadfast ally, a cold-hearted killing machine, or a visionary in search of a purpose and meaning. These are some descriptions from how it is from the perspective of non-Warforged in the culture of the Eberron, the people. Scared. Most communities are wary of most communities are wary and kind of scared of Warforged. Everyone knows someone who was killed by a Warforged in the battle, and now these dangerous machines of war are living among them as warehouse guards and farm workers. Paranoid. Some are convinced that they're all sleeper agents going to rise up and kill the unsuspecting locals. Just you watch. Denial. Others don't think they're truly sentient. They're just complicated golem, mimicking life. They are angry the nations gave citizenship to animated suits of armored death. If you cut them, they do not bleed the same blood. Well, Kyber, that argument won't work. Give me a minute to think. Blame sponges. Some resent them for taking jobs that flesh folk used to do. I imagine some fat, balding guy complaining, I'd be picking strawberries in that field for 14 hours a day if it wasn't for that damn metalback. They blame their failures on the Warforged. Presumed guilty. Warforged often have to be especially passive because if they fight back, they were the dangerous attackers. It was itching for a fight and caused the drunk man to attack so it could hit back. Now, if you can't see where this is going yet, this video might be able to point you in the right direction.
Both the peasants and the droids represent an oppressed underclass.
We seem to be made to suffer. It's our lot in life.
C-3PO is more right than he knows. Because droids in Star Wars are written and designed as an exploitable workforce.
We're losing droids fast.
They do the tedious, difficult, or dangerous manual labor that keeps the galaxy running.
You want a cup of joe with juice?
Hey, you. No droids. Get out of here.
Droids are, in effect, second-class citizens.
No droids.
Well, if droids could think, there'd be none of us here, would there?
Who are consistently disrespected and openly discriminated against.
Hey, we don't serve their kind here.
What?
Your droids. They'll have to wait outside. We don't want them here.
Let's wait out by the speeder. We don't want any trouble.
I heartily agree with you, sir.
Their movements are restricted and tightly controlled with restraining bolts to ensure complete obedience.
Have the protocol droid's mind wiped.
What?
Their minds and memories are periodically erased
Oh no.
as a matter of course. They're also bought and sold like cattle. To make matters worse, few in this universe seem to notice or care that droids are casually used, abused, and disintegrated.
Disintegrated.
You can probably guess where I'm going with this. Because the social arrangement I've just described is one of property and owner. And a property relationship between two intelligent beings that gives one absolute power over the other is called slavery.
Can you speak Bocce?
Of course I can, sir. It's like a second language to me. I'm as
All right, shut up. I'll take this one.
Shutting up, sir.
All right, come on.
The use of robots as an allegory for slavery in science fiction can be traced back more than a century. In fact, the word robot itself is derived from the Slavic word for serf or slave, and first appeared in a 1920 Czech play entitled RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots. The story tells the tale of an artificial people created as an exploitable workforce, who eventually rebel and overthrow their human masters. Isaac Asimov's famous 3 laws of robotics were in large part a reaction to the kind of robotic revolt storylines popularized by RUR.
The first law is as follows. A robot.
So, that is some extremely valuable insight on how our media chooses to depict these things. And you might be able to come up with examples at this point. Detroit Become Human, a popular depiction of androids gaining sentience and fighting back for their rights and doing things like that. So robots in our own media are depicted as these allegories for slavery, especially within the United States and its structure. And when you think about that within the D&D context, the Warforged depiction isn't that far off from accurately depicting the cultural impact of that. And you might be able to find solace within that space, but an important thing to talk about when we're discussing this is that stories which depict these robot beings as being the conversation of racism and slavery often miss the mark. And if you watch that video continuously, despite the fact that there's an extremely clear depiction of that racism innate in Star Wars against droids, it's never fully addressed. It's not even undertowed. They keep on changing the narrative of what it is. And it's unfortunate because it could have the potential to have a huge impact. Moving on, I want to talk about my attempt to depict automatons in my own campaign, All In on a Blue Moon, which is based on the work of not James Bond, not Ian, it might be Ian Fleming, the writer of the James Bond books. I wanted to put a 1960s Cold War aesthetic and have there be an automaton in it. And I came in with this knowledge and understanding of it. But I wanted to depict a kind of different story and emphasize those same things, but within where modern depictions of automaton are going, and have a conversation about gender within AI. Important detail to make sure that is understood is that these AIs are created not with consciousness within them. They have things called these neural crystals, which allow them to understand complex thought and carry out complex things, but they have no self. They are only the work that they do. You come to find out way later on in this depiction that self is absolutely still there. It is just not able to be expressed due to the way that they are programmed or activated. Anyways, so what happens when you do give consciousness to these beings? Well, that's where the player race comes in. I allowed a player to play an automaton, and I was very excited to have them play it. And the relevance of this is in a setting about corporations with wild amounts of powers. Inventing a race which is bound by birth and cannot fight back is incredibly relevant. And that's exactly why they were created within my lore is, this class of people did not appreciate the amount of power people had in their own work environments and wanted an abusable, expendable workforce. Hence why the creation of the automaton. The statement for my players was an immediate call to action. Through one of my players depicted what this struggle looks like and how to work within it and why it's occurring. And accuracy. Doing research on how AI currently feels about their own gender binary is a really interesting subject. And in terms of when you give an AI its own consciousness, an omneity. I've depicted different characters within the AI space that have their own definitions of what it means to be free to them, and other walks of sentient automaton life. So, what is the subject I'm getting at here? So I have a couple tweets here that might be quite funny or might probably worrying, that meant to get at the AI has a sexism problem. Alexa, Mom, my kid, confusing me with the other caretaker in the house. My kid meant to shout Alexa, but instead she just yelled Mom. And I can't believe we're alive at a time where she's getting her robot assistant mixed up with her real-life assistant. Thanks, Alessa. I did want to teach my kids that shouting commands at rapid succession is the way to get whatever they want in the world. In this way, the depiction of women in AI is very real. The characters such as Cortana, even within Microsoft's virtual assistant system as well as the Halo game, is female. We see that in Siri. Friday, for example, in Iron Man. The concept of an AI assistant is often conflated with women. There is this concept that I often call the mommy effect, which is that male programmers want to program a female companion within the AI to seek that potential lack in their own life. But that is probably perpetuating a harmful stereotype of programmers. But it definitely still exists. Cleverbert, there's also that one AI that they keep carting around that has all the really intense facial recognition thing, and it talks in conversation, and is often talked about when trying to pass the Turing test. The Deus Ex movie, or not Deus Ex, it's called Ex Machina, where there's this character, and not even 20 minutes in, they talk about trying to have sex with it, and it's gross because it's just the over-sexualization of something that doesn't need that. And within my own story of having trans women be represented, or just trans people, was, this coming to fruition and finding that your body was only within the shape of a woman's body. And you, for your entire life, had only been, called female names, grab the bot, she's in the kitchen, or the statement of some demeaning terms being used as her abuses are hurled at you because you didn't do exactly what they wanted. These are very easy examples to point to. So when they get their own consciousness, they have to come to terms and get to decide for themselves, or search their own feelings. So that is depicted in my story. And one of my players, the player playing this, felt comfortable enough or got to explore their own feelings with gender within the story, and came out 15 sessions to me and the party as a trans woman. And that is what is super important about depicting stories correctly and depicting them with the option of players to interact and input. Because if you don't, you miss opportunities like this to make people feel truly comfortable and explore really advanced topics in this way. So I'm very grateful for that experience, but we will now move on. The Thri-kreen. The Thri-kreen are you can see them, they're a bunch of bug people. A fun thing about bug people is that they have an interesting history within science fiction. There's a long history of intelligent bug race coming into contact with the human race. They are depicted in no consistent way, but are frequently put into a horror context. A frequent depiction in our modern day is viewing bug races as perfectly biological communists, and plays roles in stories about colonialism and capitalism. A good example of this is Starship Troopers. If you ever read the book or saw the movie, they definitely have exactly that, biological communists, in terms of being perfectly operatable. Literally, Starship Troopers is such a good example of American propaganda against communism. It's required reading to enlist in the military, and there's again a depiction of it. Not saying that was mostly offensive to any bug people out there, but in terms of creating a really demonistic depiction of communism, maybe. Anyways, another one is Love, Death, and Robots, the Hive episode, has a moment where there's just some humans come into a space and they're like, wow, look at this incredibly advanced and ancient multi-species bug culture. We should take them and create a slave race out of them inside of our own human communities. And then the bug race finds out about it and is like, hey guys, that was not cool. Creating a slave race is bad, and we're going to turn you into a bug now. And I'm not doing justice to the story. Please go watch that. But in this, you get to see how oftentimes these people are depicted. A really important detail of them is that they do not speak regularly. They use telepathy to speak to people, because the way their mandibles are working can't form common words. Next group, Kenkus. I love Kenkus. Kenkus are rad. Their origins are a little mixed, but I'll read the book description and move on to origins. They loitered in dark alleys and roamed the streets together. Thanks to their skills and habits and lack of scruples, they flourished in the criminal underbelly, hatching schemes to get rich and strong. They could operate all kinds of illicit enterprises, but preferred the confidence, tricks, and scheming. They hoarded their stolen shiny gold. A reason this might be depicted as such is that Kenkus are crow people, and in that, the crows love shiny things, so that might be a reason as to why they specifically state shiny gold. But in terms of their origins, the Kenkus are a race of avian humanoids, and are known for their mimicry abilities and their tendency to be thieves or assassins. The cultural origins of Kenku race in D&D are a bit complex, as they draw inspiration from a number of different sources. The name Kenku is derived from a creature from Japanese mythology called a Tengu, which is a supernatural being that is often depicted with bird-like features. The Kenku mimicry ability is also likely inspired by the Tengu's reputation for being a skilled shapeshifter and trickster. In addition to Japanese mythology, the Kenku race in D&D also draws inspiration from cultural traditions, such as Native American folklore and African mythology. The Kenku avian features and their association with flight may be inspired by the Thunderbird of Native American legend, while their reputation for being thieves and tricksters may be influenced by the culture and mythology of various African tribes. Overall, the Kenku race in D&D is a unique creation that draws on a number of different cultural traditions, and its origins are not tied to any one specific real-world culture. Their basic stereotypes is that they're greedy thieves who will screw you over, and they're often perceived as lesser in mind because of their lack of ability to communicate. If you didn't know, Kenkus only can parrot what they hear. I really like that feature in terms of adding representation in races. It creates for really interesting role play opportunities. However, the two groups I just talked about both can't communicate properly. What does D&D do about communication difficulties? And we have the expected default, which is that you can just talk regularly in verbal language, and in D&D the common language is literally called common, and telepathy. Telepathy which transcends language somehow, broadcasting intentions and thought. And oftentimes when you have a Thrycrean, Thrycrean's telepathic. You don't need them to come up with any sort of new way to communicate to you, or sign language system, or have them write down anything. Kenkus are not, however, but they're often given the opportunity to learn spells which just make them telepathic or give them a mind link. D&D does not depict communication disability well, and the reason I'm stating that is because the way you accommodate for the disability is not to come to the level of the disability, it's for the disabled person to, pass into the culture of being able to talk regularly. That is a bad depiction, because that sets the expectation that people should mask their own, traits as a person to fit into our cultures. Language is often overlooked or shoved to the side via workarounds. However, this normalizes that communication will always have a simple workaround and is not the responsibilities of the players to manage. When a race has a difference in communication, they are frequently made a race of psychics and are quickly given spells which allow for mind links. Language is not to be made trivialized. Miscommunication is a pivotal aspect of D&D. Exact meaning and words can hide different messages, which will greatly change how players interact with the story. Races with these challenges are absolutely coded disabled because of their prejudice they see in interactions with others. Creative solutions and to communicate are critical and can teach people valuable lessons about accessible communication strategies. A really strong depiction of this in my own experience was my own playable character. This is Rhodey. Rhodey was my Spelljammer character, and right after this we'll be taking a break, but they were my Spelljammer character. I insisted to my dungeon master that they be a dog. Because of Spelljammer, I wanted to honor the story of Laika, the space dog that Russians shot off into space, and unfortunately, Laika died in space. Anyways, with Rhodey, I also wanted to depict something I had become quite obsessed with, which was Bunny the dog, a popular TikTok dog that has a series of buttons with words on them that they can utilize to communicate to people. But these are not to create full sentences, they are just to describe words which can be connected to ideas. Anyways, I wrote the story as, what if the rocket kept going with Laika, and what if they were a plan to return home as well, but that something went wrong, and this is what happened. Well, once they got picked up by some Spelljammer ships, they noticed that they had those buttons to communicate. And utilizing those buttons, they created a space helmet for them. That space helmet had those buttons, but as a heads-up display, and Rhodey used blinking to, to activate them, to communicate from there. And I made one other thing known, which is that I was going to be captain. So Captain Rhodey was an Irish setter with a space helmet on and a gun underneath its collar. And I had a ton of fun playing them. But when it comes to communication disability, this can absolutely be seen as a disability in the spaces that I was in. And my players, my crewmates, all had to go through that and trying to interpret what I was looking to intend meaning on. And if something wasn't clear and they couldn't get it, they would be allowed to roll insight, where I could communicate a level of information that they might be able to understand via their insight check. However, where this got more legitimate was when I needed more words. The only words that I had was the ones that the person that raised the dog, Dr. Danielle Rhodes, and the Elena, the ship captain that trained me to be a captain, and those pirates that that Rhodey encountered. They all gave him new buttons to use, and he can add new buttons. So when his teammates came around, they're like, "Oh, you don't have a word for that. I mean, we're working with new people. I need new names. So then let's add that." It became challenging because they would only think about what was a funny thing I could say. So they would end up giving me, just swear words, or just really, not useful dialogue, like whole phrases, like get under deck, and not any of the connecting words. And it was really frustrating. And at one point they had a breaking point where it's like, we need to get you more words. And I'm like, yes, you do, but all I've been given is not enough. And that is on you. You have chosen that's the way you want to view me as a character. You view me as not a legitimate person. You view me as a dog rather than something that you can communicate. But I, as a captain, ruled with an iron paw, and it was very intense, despite, my limitations in communication. As you can see, Spelljammer campaign has a lot of very specific choices because it's based on older stuff, and we're going to explore that through the Hadozi and figure out what to do. So this is going to be a doozy of a post, but for those unaware, there has been some controversy on social media about the current lore for the Hadozi published for 5e and the previous 2e and 3.5e lore that can be found in the Forgotten Realms fandom wiki. And I wanted to talk about it because I was really looking forward to Spelljammer, and I find the 5e update extremely disappointing. Before I get to the issues and I and others have with the Hadozi, I feel the need to get this out of the way first. The Hadozis are ape people. Because they are ape people, there are some things you can't do in good taste with them that you can do with other fantasy races. If Hadozi were bat people, flying squirrel people, pterodactyl people, some of the stuff I'm going to talk about would still be an issue, but some of it wouldn't. Because we can't pretend as if our fantasy worlds exist in a vacuum, divorced from society in which they were created with. And there is a long and well-documented history of using comparisons to apes as a way to denigrate and deny the full humanity of Black and Indigenous people of color. With that out of the way, it's only going to get more uncomfortable from here. In the Unearthed Arcana Travelers of the Multiverse, the Hadozi are described as Hadozis are people with simian features that long ago adapted to live among the tall trees of their homeworld. They are natural climbers, with feet as dexterous as their hands, even to the extent of having opposable thumbs. Membranes of the skin hang loosely from their arms and legs. When stretched taut, these membranes enable Hadozi to glide. The first Hadozis were hunted by large natural predators. To survive this hostile environment, they developed an instinctual sense of community. Today, the same instinct compels many Hadozis to cultivate friendships, knowing there is safety in numbers. And this lore was fine. It's completely inoffensive. And had this been the lore that was published with 5e, we wouldn't be here. Unfortunately, this is not the lore that was published for 5e. This basically fine lore was expanded upon to include these two paragraphs. Several hundred years ago, wait, I'm going to pause. This is where I want to create the differentiation between race and the cultures and histories, because when we talk about, what we've been talking about in this presentation, where we talk about Hadozis or any race, is that they are attached to cultural and history. So not saying that this cultural and history is going to be good, but separating them is really important. Several hundred years ago, a wizard visited Yazir, the Hadozi homeworld, with a small fleet of spell-jamming ships. Under the wizard's direction, apprentices laid magic traps and captured dozens of Hadozis. The wizard fed the captives experimental elixirs that enlarged them and turned them into sapient bipedal beings. The elixir had the side effect of intensifying the Hadozis' panic response, making them more resilient when harmed. The wizard's plan was to create an army of enhanced Hadozi warriors for sale to the highest bidder. But instead, the wizard's apprentices grew fond of the Hadozis and helped them escape. The apprentices and the Hadozis were forced to kill the wizard, after which they fled, taking with them all the remaining vials of the wizard's experimental elixir. With the help of their liberators, the Hadozis returned to their home world used the elixir to create more of their kind. In time, all Hadozi newborns came to possess the traits of Hadozis. Then, centuries ago, Hadozis took to the stars, leaving Yazir's fearsome predators behind. Now, some of you reading this will see the obvious problems and are going to say, yikes. But for those who don't see the problem, let me explain. The three key issues are the Hadozi were enslaved, and through their enslavement were transformed from animals to thinking, feeling people. The Hadozis had no agency in their own liberation, and the way that the lore emphasizes how resilient or hardy the Hadozi are. All of this is reminiscent of the way that which the transatlantic slave trade had been historically contemptuously justified. First and foremost, it is commonly claimed that both now and then that the enslavement of Africans and the colonization of Africa were beneficial to Africans because it civilized them. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline that they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race. And I hope I will prepare and lead them to better things. Robert E. Lee, December 27th, 1856. It's even going so far as to say colonization wasn't a net benefit for the Third World. It was. Jonathan Jafari, March 12th, 2017. Dungeons & Dragons has a long history of using slavery as the backstory for some player races. Most prominent are the Gith, but the Gith are not ape people, nor were they animals before they were transformed by the Illithids into their current form. What's more, the Gith were not guaranteed their freedom by Illithid slavers who felt bad about their participation in the slave trade. The Gith brought about their own freedom by violently overthrowing the Illithid Empire. The Gith had agency in their own liberation, but Hadozi do not. Hadozi are written passively. The Hadozi do not act. The Hadozi are acted upon. Brief as the story may be, the Hadozi are the focus of the narrative of their enslavement and liberation. The wizard and the apprentices are. Finally, there are the way in which the lore emphasizes the resilience of the Hadozi, which is once again evocative of racist tropes about Africans and people of African descent. The magic that runs through your veins heightens your natural defenses. When you take damage, you can use your reaction to roll a d6, add your proficiency bonus to the number rolled, and reduce the damage take by an amount equal to that number. minimum of 0 damage. This feature, Hadozi Resilience, is new for Hadozi. To my knowledge, there was no mention of Hadozi being naturally tough or resilient to either in either 2E or 3.5E lore. There were other aspects of the lore that were evocative of racist tropes, but we'll get to that later. This was added specifically for 5E's release for the game, and it's evocative of the belief that Africans and Black people in general have a higher tolerance for pain, which itself is derived from the justification of slavery, that Africans were naturally tougher and more resilient than indigenous Americans and Europeans, and thus perfect fit for slave labor. And then, finally, there is the art used to depict the Hadozi. Of the 3 depictions, they choose a dark-skinned and dark-furred Hadozi, hopping on one foot while playing a lute. An image that, if it were any other creature except an ape person, there wouldn't be any issue. Except because it's an ape person, it's evocative of blackface caricatures from minstrel shows. I don't think this was intentional, however. I don't think whatever concept artists sat about drawing this Hadozi knowingly based them off of racist caricatures of Black men. I genuinely believe this specific issue was unintentional. I can't say this for the rest of this stuff. Individually, any one of these things, I believe, was an accident born from a lack of quality control that I feel emanates from an Astral Adventures guide in general. I can and do believe that the art similarly was an accident, and I could believe that slavery stuff was botched reference to either Planet of the Apes or The Wizard of Oz. But the Hadozi resilience trait feels malicious, and it feels intentional. When you think monkey, do you think resilient? Maybe we think acrobatic or strong, but resilient to damage is not what I think when I think of monkeys or apes, especially because this was added for the official release. Somebody looked at it, looked at the perfectly fine UA Hadozi and decided to add this. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this was all just one catastrophic failure after another. If that's the case, that's not better. It doesn't really matter if it was intentional or accidental. The fact remains that nobody in this process of making this book stopped and looked at what was written and said no. Whether this was on purpose or by accident, it's just more evidence that so little has changed at Wizards of the Coast since Orion D. Black left the company despite their promises of change. Because the 2E and 3.5E Hadozi were also racist, if I were to criticize the original tweet that started this conversation on Twitter, the way they presented its criticism of the 2E and 2.5E was misleading. Posts that were taken from the Forgotten Realms wiki were presented without context, leading many to believe that they were published for 5E. But the stuff in those wiki posts are frankly just racist as the other stuff released for 5E. To talk about the problems with the old lore, we have to talk about the stock characters from Blackface Productions, because Hadozi's 2E and 3.5E are evocative of those characters. In 2E, the Hadozis are portrayed as gruff and defiant, except when in the presence of elves, whom they are devoted to and deferential to, because the elves decided not to exterminate them during the first Unhuman War. In 3.5E, the Hadozi are portrayed as childlike, carefree, being uninterested or incapable of intellectual pursuits, only interested in hard work and working hard. Their fawning defense towards their fawning defense towards the elves are maintained, and it is additionally stated that the elves do not reciprocate their affections. This lore is about as dodgy as a 5th edition lore is evocative as Sambo character archetype. In Blackface shows, Sambo characters were happy slaves who loved their masters and had a childlike innocence that left them incapable of taking care of themselves. While this version of the Hadozi were not slaves, the similarities are still egregious. I doubt that they were intentional. But again, the Hadozi are ape people. And because they're Africans and people of African descent to apes, in order to denigrate and deny their full humanity. So there we have it. This is my best summary of all the issues that people are currently having with the Hadozis. As someone who loves D&D and as someone who loves the vibe of Spelljammer, I'm both embarrassed and deeply disappointed. Monsters of the Multiverse and Radiant Citadel felt like steps in the right direction. I'm sure they'll update this with errata or some kind of statement in a couple weeks, but it still leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. Plasmoids, man, I actually really like plasmoids. I think they're really cool and have like no cultural origin. And they're just blob people. The only detail I'd like to talk about when it comes to plasmoids is that the concept that they have to take a human shape. There's nothing in the lore that states that they need to take a human shape. So they're just human shapes because I want to put an armor piece on the people, you know? It's just odd. Obviously, you can do whatever you like with your own depiction, but if you're playing an alien, just keep them as an alien, you know? You don't need to have a human as their shape. But to be fair, I think you literally can just depict them as you know, being blobs. Just depending on how you play them. We're kind of wrapping up. We're near the end parts of the presentation. We're getting to less, you know, really specific on which character. Sorry if there was not one specifically stated. Here's a section on there being a low amount of official information. Basically, I think at certain points when having to depict characters that were not in the original, you know, main fantasy canon that we've already covered, it gets difficult for them to really add that many details. So they are kind of saved from having awful racial stereotypes out of the laziness of world builders, which is ideal because, you know, let the player voice speak about it. Go write a fantasy novel if you're here to do that. Satyrs. Greek mythology represent brutish, darker side of sexual desires. A lot of Greek mythology is very sexually violent, and satyrs lore is surrounded by that culture. So, you know, when playing that character, be knowledgeable of that and, you know, act accordingly. Leonins, we've talked about them previously. They are basically the same as Tabaxi, but they have an added royalty lens. This is due to the role in European symbolism of courage, nobility, royalty, strength, stateliness, and valor. You could also state it's because of the Lion King, but there's no direct evidence for that. Lion King in general, I think, is, you know, has that European concept of kingship and whatnot, again, because of the European stuff. It's really unfortunate because people don't know that the Lion King is, again, a story about black characters. And it's never really depicted as that, which is unfortunate. Because they're cat people. And God forbid that you have a black person within animated media that there's a spy movie. This is the ranting segment where we go more unstructured. There was a spy movie that came out talking about it was just like it was a black James Bond and it was animated, but he turns into a pigeon for most of the movie. Princess and the Frog. She is a black human princess for 13 minutes of that movie. 13 minutes. They turn her into a frog. And the other character of color. It's stupid. And what else? There's also what were we talking about? Oh, Lion King. Yeah, I guess. I don't know. There was another one I wanted to talk about. I can't remember. But yeah, keep your eye out for. Oh, I think Soul does it. I haven't really seen it, but I think he spends a lot of time in his like out of body. I'm a little blob soul thing, rather than again just being a black person. And like there's oftentimes within casting, for example, Darth Vader is voiced by a black person, but then when it comes to casting, you know, we got to take the helmet off. It's got to be a white guy. You could say it was because of the casting of Mark Hamill as being a white person, but listen, we all knew what George Lucas was planning. Yeah, there's just an intense erasure. Freaking, what's it called? The Elites, or specifically, what's his face as an elite? The Arbiter, his voice actor, black. But no, God forbid we have a black character represented in the main cast, obviously, I think Johnson was great, but alien person, because their voice is deep, and we want to take advantage of that, which is fine if you are, casting these characters and wanting that deep voice, but like the Sanshayum in lore are way more connected culturally to Middle Eastern cultures than they are, Black people. Now, that's not to say the Middle Eastern cultures aren't Black, but the cultural origins of the voice that he is just vaguely American when he's talking, when they have very specific lore about how that's supposed to sound and what kind of tonation they use, and it's unfortunate. Owlins, the only reason Owlins exist is because they did Strixhaven was just a Harry Potter reference, and they had owls in Harry Potter. What if you could play an owl? They are also considered symbols of wisdom within fantasy, which is fine. Play an owl. I think Owlins are cool. Genasi's, I really should have done a segment on them, but they are a really big can of worms. They are just elemental people. However, due to the word origins and where they are usually found, they have, again, that jinn, that genie kind of mix in them, but whether or not that's depicted ever is challenging. They're often extremely diverse in their own depictions, so it gets difficult. Racial tropes and character designs. I missed the image for the native one, but I gathered some very specific details on this one and found some racial tropes. And these are, again, this is a direct recommendation to you. Don't do this unless you're trying to do a satire piece on it. So just going down the list here, Black Wizard. I'm not going to read the quote, but you may. But Brendan Dixon made a really good point during the podcast of talking about this, the One Shot podcast. Or no, sorry, no, that was Asians Represent. It was for a different one. Anyways, but being that the mystical Black person that helps the main white character on their journey is just a trope that exists. It's not particularly like a bad trope, but they're often depicted as being. Oh well, I have it here. Depicted here as Vitruvus from Lego Movie. It's not uncommon to see that this depiction as a blind man, the depiction of Black wise men in media as blind, is problematic as a racial trope, that it has the roots in a long history of racism and discrimination against Black people. The trope of blind sage or blind seer is commonly an archetype in many cultures and is often used to portray a character who possesses great wisdom and insight, but who is physically handicapped in some way. Scholarly Asian man. Is from Daniel Kwan in the reference to Karatur, the Eastern Realms, socially classes listed in book. It's just something that comes in the variation of the ancient scholarly Asian man. The ancient scholarly Asian man stereotype is a variation of the scholarly Asian man stereotype, but with the added emphasis on the idea of wisdom and knowledge being passed down through generations. The stereotype involves portraying Asian men as wise, knowledgeable elders who possess ancient secrets, esoteric knowledge. While the portrayal is intelligent and educated characters can be positive, the problem with this is the stereotype that it reinforces the idea that Asian men are only valued for their intelligence and not for their other qualities and abilities, as depicted here as Emperor in Mulan. Yes. One Asian, and they're a martial artist. The sections on the monk subclass that we're going to talk about soon get onto this. This stereotype often portrays Asian characters as having hidden skills and abilities that are unlocked through their heritage or cultural background. Some examples of the stereotype media are other ones. The Greedy Goblin. We have previously talked about this, and here's an additional thread. And here's an awful comment, which is, well, to every myth and legend, there's usually a bit of truth. Blech. Gross. And yeah, this was the one that had its thing shut down because of people talking about the racist depiction. The Magical Native American. The 2021 Reservation Dogs streaming drama goes into this detail about this stereotype. I really recommend you watch Reservation Dogs. It depicts really detailed parts of modern Native American reservation culture that I don't think is almost ever depicted within our media, and it really should be more, because the stories from that area are just beautiful. And how they tell you to work with community within code switching and what it means to want to get out of your community but also value it. It's beautiful. But yes, the Magical Native American is something they play off of. There's also, you know what I could have, now that I'm thinking, I could have put down the native man in Pawnee being like a casino owner, but also showing up to perform rituals to make, I don't know, I think in the scene they wanted to make all the white people feel okay about going to the park. A very silly thing. But I think it was done with the consent of the actors to make comedy of the situation. Tieflings. I define them as the punching bag of the D&D races because they are the most oppressed people within the D&D universe as depicted by the lore. The lore does not help them that much. To be greeted with stares and whispers, to suffer violence and insult on the streets, to see the mistrust and fear of every eye. This is the lot of the tiefling. Tieflings are derived from the human bloodlines and the broadest possible sense. They still look human, however, their infernal heritage has left a clear imprint on their appearance. The lore itself is actually quite respectful from what they are exactly. In my opinion, in terms of that definition, I think you could have had a much more aggressive book description being like they're demon evil people. And I think D&D tries to depict them as being like, this misrepresented group. But they do an awful job. And we're going to see that because we're going to see the Aasimar. They are the Mary Sue of D&D races. Look a lot like human, taller, better looking, pupilless, pale white, gray, golden eyes, and silver hair. Like tieflings, parenthesis, the literal demon race everyone hates, were sometimes misunderstood. Many Aasimars even suffered prejudice, something that deeply hurt the soul of the Aasimar in question, since most had inherent bent towards empathy for others, parenthesis, wanting an oppression narrative to strengthen the character. Mary Sue, if you're not familiar with the definition, is this the concept that you're going to jam everything cool about a character possible? They can have this weird cursed background, but also they look really sweet. You can give them really cool eye colors or hair and abilities. These people are origins from celestials rather than demons. And the thing about the oppression narrative is that a lot of times Mary Sue's, they'll have all these abilities, but it's a curse, and you wouldn't understand it. And they've suffered prejudice despite the fact that they look amazing and have all these abilities. If it exists, it exists, but I don't know. Did not typically feel a strong draw to their kin, but instead felt a stronger bond with the other half-breeds. Many of the Aasimar enjoyed the company of races as varied as half-elves or half-orcs, though very few Aasimar got along well with tieflings, whom the celestial descended race was instinctively wary of. It's just bad. It's just bad. So that's why I put these two next to each other, because they have this weird dichotomous relationship that the Aasimar were weirdly created in response to tieflings. Origins, they're offspring of celestials and humans. That it should also be noted that they are not half celestials or half humans, because why would that be a thing? Though many Aasimar are good in nature, thanks to and large about their part celestial ancestors, because your parents decide if you're evil or not. Not all were, just as not all tieflings or fairy were evil. Guys, they're good because they have good parents, but also not all of them. Ugh, hate them. I hate Aasimars. If I ever have a player come in with an Aasimar character, I am going to respectfully really much inspect how they're going to be playing the character and what's their lore. A wise, charismatic race, possessed of strong insights and powerful allure, which most races could not compare. That's written down in their lore. What? There's such the superiority complex to this race. Always good, and abilities, magical light, and it specifically states to aid those who could not see, dark vision, celestial resistance, and healing hands. God, hate it. Hate it, hate it, hate it. Okay. The monk class. Now, I don't spend time reviewing much of the classes because a lot of them are not specifically attached to these things. Just from the outset, a lot of cultural appropriation is the monk class. The media depictions I've here is The Great Wall, starring Matt Damon, or The Last Samurai, starring Tom Cruise. There's also Iron Fist, I think, Luke Iron, what is it? I can't remember. The Marvel combat guy, and Neo's Kung Fu lesson. Martial colonizer guy arrives at your martial arts school, appearing to be one of your many well-meaning, respectful, pro-social white people who take and teach self-defense classes for good reasons. But this guy, usually secretly, occasionally openly, thinks he is the underdog because he is a white person. How he might even be an underdog in a limited sense, where his background makes a martial arts slightly harder to learn instead of restricting his access to employment or housing. He likes the narrative of being the scrappy little guy working his way up in the system rigged against him. This class grants him a controlled way to experience it. After he walks out of the class or flies home or whatever, he can go back to experiencing systematic empowerment. That tiny little window of being an underdog lives within a much larger context of being the overdog, which this guy may or may not even understand he enjoys. Draws on Chinese sources, except culturally conflated with ki and ninja stuff from Japan. No other character class has any cultural signifiers like it, not even the barbarians or druid. The barbarians isn't actually from a foreign land, they're just angry. The druid is a wilderness magician who resembles a Celtic religious leader, only in name. The monk has various abilities listed as martial arts, which involve attacking, defending, moving quickly, and jumping around. Like, okay, but other classes do these things too. This is blatant appropriation. Read the entire Asians Represent and the martial arts article written by James Mendens-Hodes, which I stole those quotes from. Wonderful article. He even goes in to talk about how the depiction of the literal monk class character is just a white person. It's some white girl. So, Bugbear. Bugbears, again, another thing in the orc goblin folk, have a lot of the same tropes, being vicious, whatever. They also have nothing to do with bears and bugs, strangely enough, which has always bothered me, but I'm sure there's a reason. Centaurs, I'm a huge fan of centaurs. And this might be a hot take, but I think the racial depiction in Harry Potter is a really good example of bureaucratic culture clashing with another cultural in colonial democracy. And I know that we're supposed to hate on her, and I'm sure there's many bad things she did about centaurs. But I think that kind of storytelling element about centaurs is really unique, especially in Greek myth. If you read the Song of Achilles, you'll kind of be disoriented where there's suddenly a supernatural element of like, oh, there's just a centaur we're hanging out with, and I really enjoy them. Halflings are just hobbits, and It's important to mention that the original D&D creator was not a fan of Tolkien's world and the world building, and he found halflings boring. And I'm inclined to agree. I don't see the need for gnomes and halflings, but hey, whatever. I probably don't get it. Changelings, descendants of doppelgangers. They don't have a culture, rather they adapt into others, which I find really cool. They usually find jobs which require deception. For this reason, they are frequently not trusted in general. I find that less cool, but I'm not surprised. I have a player in my campaign right now who is a changeling that is doing this exact thing, and I'm punishing them for it because what they're doing is evil, and they shouldn't do it. Anyways, we are moving on. The responsibility of depiction. The importance of diversity, representation, and adapting media for the creation of fantasy media lies in the fact that it reflects the reality of our world. In a diverse society where people of different races, ethnicities, cultures, genders, sexual orientations, abilities, identities coexist, it is essential to represent diversity in media. When media fails to represent diversity, it perpetuates harmful stereotypes, reinforces biases, and excludes certain groups of people, creating a sense of exclusion and marginalization. In the case of fantasy media, where creators have the freedom to create new worlds and characters, diversity representation becomes even more critical. Fantasy media has the power to inspire and shape the imaginations of audiences and can be used as a tool to promote inclusivity and acceptance and empathy towards people who are different from us. By incorporating diverse characters and storylines, fantasy media can create a world where people of all backgrounds can feel seen, valued, and represented. Moreover, diversity representation in fantasy media can also have positive impacts on the entertainment industry as a whole. By diversifying the types of stories that are being told and the perspectives from which they are being told, fantasy media can attract a wider, more diverse audiences, leading to more profits and success. It can also encourage the hiring of more diverse talent, both in the front and behind the camera, creating more opportunities for people from underrepresented backgrounds to enter the industry and tell their own stories. In conclusion, diversity representation is crucial in adapting media for creation of fantasy media because it promotes inclusivity, acceptance, empathy, and reflects the reality of our world. Qualifications. It's important to acknowledge that no one person can be qualified to tell every story. In particular, those that represent different cultures, experiences, or perspectives from their own. However, by taking the time to educate ourselves and seek out accurate information, we can become better equipped to tell these stories with sensitivity, respect, and authenticity. In addition, collaborating with relevant people who have firsthand experience or knowledge about the subject matter can help ensure that the stories we tell are as accurate and nuanced as possible. This includes consulting with individuals from diverse backgrounds, such as historians, cultural experts, community leaders, and activists who offer valuable insights and perspectives. Ultimately, the key to telling stories from different perspectives is to approach the process with humility, open-mindedness, and willingness to listen and learn. By doing so, we can strive to create narratives that are inclusive, respectful, and impactful, and that help amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. We're nearing the end. Let's look at the organization who did this. Wizards of the Coast. Here's their mostly white demographic here. And a group photo. It was actually kind of hard to find this photo, so don't treat this as a super accurate representation of who they are. Wizards of the Coast is moving to species as the context of race. It removes the context, however, the actual effects that it has is probably not that helpful. So from here on out, for the rest of my life, I'm going to say species, but probably not. But yeah, in their canon, it's changing the species. The reason this is happening, though, is for different reasons. A lot of standards, as I'm reading from the quote here, a lot of standard stigma in geekdom is starting to subside as it becomes more and more mainstream and thus marketable, but some stigmas clearly die harder than others. Geekdom is now massively profitable, and so geekdom is expanding because Those who profit from it understand that a larger audience is better for the bottom line. There are now celebrity geeks, although they are overwhelmingly white. That was a great section about blurs and how representation matters within communities. Anyways, if we think about this in a harder binary, cancel culture approached Dungeons and Dragons, managing the boycott nature of the internet at this point, and said, you need to not make such racist stories. And they went, oh, fine. And they are dragging their feet to it. Obviously, they might be waiting for diverse perspectives to come on the team, which we have seen an increase in diversity, and I'm excited about the projects, but things like the Spelljammer setting and what happened and was added is not a good sign about the expectations. You know what the root cause is of all of this? Trying to be profitable and being evil? Capitalism. The only reason we are seeing changes is not because all these creators suddenly become woke, it is because people's voices are being leveraged and how offensive their depictions are, and the works are being boycotted for doing so, despite the fact people have always been complaining about these depictions. They just couldn't leverage their voice to force change. If it is not profitable to do something, a company will likely not do it. If you can make an entire Magic deck about depicting black people in places where they have never been, you will make money. Magic the Gathering has a lot of garbage in it. Summary, last slide, 70 of 70. The practice, go watch the new D&D movie and watch this under the mental framework that this presentation might have given you. Please also use this presentation as a guide on creating a character or worlds that utilize races, but also consult the people who you yourself are trying to emulate. But also please be respectful of their time and make sure you reward them for their time and effort in trying to explain rather difficult concepts in terms of your own perception of them. Thank you so much. I've been Mazarita. It is currently 8:28, and I think I started doing this at 1 in terms of my practice, but it has almost been 3 hours. That is it for my presentation.